Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And we here in Good Faith are in the middle of a series on Advent, because I really believe that Advent is actually designed to help us make sense of the world, but perhaps in ways that might surprise us a little or that we're not used to from our usual Christmas culture. So just to recap, Advent comes from the Latin word adventus, which means the coming or arrival. It's translated in Greek to parousia. And that word is a potent word in Greco-Roman culture. It is the word that usually was used to announce the arrival of a new king, some new king that had basically kicked the butts of all other rivals to the thrones, won the battle, and was now sending messengers into all of the different cities of his new kingdom to say, there's a new boss in town, there's a new king, and that was the parousia, that was the announcement. And so when Christians adopted this term to announce Jesus' both first arrival, his birth, but then also his coming, future forecasted return, that was the linguistic world in which that word was used. And so Advent, which right now for us in our current culture, so far removed from that, has come to mean lighting of candles, Christmas carols, and presents. It had a very different meaning in first century world. It really was a much more potent word that said something challenging has arrived, has broken into the world that presents a challenge to the ruling kingdoms of the world that this kingdom announcement now comes into. And so I wanted our Advent series to recapture something of that edge, something of that original challenge of the original meaning of Advent. And we're doing that by trying to re-examine the four classic senses that have come to define Advent, which are the senses or the virtues of hope, peace, joy, and love. And are there ways in which we actually, when we really think about the Advent as the arrival of Jesus as this challenging new king that usurps the prevailing kingdoms of the world, does that change how we sort of experience or think or use these terms of hope, peace, joy, and love? Last episode, we did this with Hope with Sarah Billups, and she talked a lot about how a kingdom hope, a hope of the original Advent, was not the same thing as a naive optimism or an expectation that we won't suffer, but rather it was a deeper hope that doesn't mean we get to avoid setbacks or suffering, but one that actually takes us through setbacks and suffering in the hope of the arrival, the return of Jesus, who will finally make all things right. And so this week, we're going to do a kind of a similar re-examination of an Advent virtue. We're going into peace, and we're going to do so with my good friend, Andy Crouch, a recurrent guest here on the Good Faith Podcast. Andy, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Well, thank you, Curtis. Very good to be back. I'm trying to respond in a very peaceful way.
It's very soothing, soporific. That's exactly what we're talking about. No, we're talking about like peace. What is peace? Because I think peace has come to mean in the Advent series as something soothing, exactly like you said, something soothing that pacifies any existing sense of discord, dissension, conflict. Very different than, I think, like I said, that a sharp challenge of that original Advent. If I were to think of a soundtrack for current contemporary Advent culture, it would be like a Muzak theme piped through the shopping mall that's designed to just lull us into this sort of kind of calm consumer sort of posture, whereas when I think of the original Advent, it's like a rousing call to arms almost that sets your hearts and beating in a flame. So let's talk about this. What does peace mean in the kingdom sense of Jesus, of the arrival of this new kingdom, if it isn't this sort of soporific, placid, pacifying tone?
Wow. Well, yes. That's a good way to put it. It's there is one vision of peace that is everything's sort of just put to bed.
So the adults can finally watch TV, right?
Right. Whereas I think the only peace that one can faithfully talk about as a Christian is the righting of wrongs, which entails the judgment of sin, which entails actually a great deal of confrontation, if not conflict, right? It is, what does it mean to say Jesus is the Prince of Peace? It has to mean that all the unfinished business of humanity somehow is going to get finished by this one who is coming into the world. And I do not think that means we're all going to be, sort of drift off on soft tones of pleasantness, right? And of course, this was true to some extent for even the Perusia of the emperors. I mean, there's the fascinating thing about Jesus is he's born at a moment, maybe the first moment, when people are saying peace is finally coming to the whole known world. And it's coming through Augustus, who has begun reigning a few years before Jesus is born, and many years before Jesus kind of begins his public ministry, right? 30 years later or so. And Augustus brings, the Pax Augustana or the Pax Romana by, first of all, slaughtering a bunch of his family members who are rivals to the potential role of emperor, and then sending the military everywhere to kind of impose Rome's version of order. And of course, Jesus is going to bring a very different kind of peace. But he himself also said, I mean, if we're going to talk about peace, we have to talk about the fact that Jesus specifically says, "I did not come to bring peace."
Ouch.
He says,
okay, that's a challenging word. Yeah.
So whatever it is that we're looking for at Advent, Jesus, it's not the thing that Jesus disavows as the peace that he's not going to bring. He says, "I'm not bringing peace, but I'm bringing a sword." In the Gospel of Luke, Simeon, when he meets the baby Jesus, right, tells Mary, so this is very relevant to our Christmas commemoration. Here's the Mother of God, Mary. And Simeon says, after saying, that he's now finally seen the one that he has been waiting for his whole life, this child is destined for the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be opposed, so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. That's Luke chapter 2. And so whatever peace it is that we are commemorating, anticipating, invoking at Advent, it's got to include the falling and rising of many, opposition, the revealing of inner thoughts, which is hardly likely to be, you're going to discover everyone's inner thoughts are just happy and quiet and pleasant, and that Mary herself is going to feel a sword pierce her own soul. I mean, it's quite a promise, right?
I think it's important to highlight how profound of a challenge this Jesus' definition of peace is to us, because it goes deeper than just, hey, in Christmas, we forget all about Jesus. We're all about presents and celebrations. I mean, let's remember the reason for the season. That's kind of a superficial challenge. That's just really saying, okay, let's just attach Jesus to our prevailing notions of peace as calm, absence of conflict, everybody's getting along and so forth. Let's just attach Jesus to that. What you're saying, Andy, is actually, no, Jesus presents a deeper challenge than attach my name to your existing definitions of peace. I actually am bringing a new definition of peace that is far more challenging. And maybe one way we can summarize that is this is peace that is actually overturns a false piece of the world that has somehow needs to actually get punctured, right?
Yeah. I'm thinking about the feeling I've had a few times in my marriage, to my incredibly long-suffering patient wife of 30 plus years now, Catherine, where we've come to a point of tremendous conflict and have kind of let it all be said. And if you do it well, you're sort of stunned by how deep the feelings are, how deep the hurt is, anger, whatever emotions may be there. If you do it well, you do get to a point where you just sit there in kind of stunned silence and hope that you're going to get reconciled. But it's after this it depends on the marriage. It depends on the people. And I don't think I'm here to talk about all these most painful, intimate details of my marriage or anyone's, but one way or another, everything comes out, right?
Yeah.
And all the truth comes out. And then on the other side of that, there's this stillness and waiting. And what are you waiting for? You're waiting for the real peace, which is going to include the memory of having been through all of that conflict, I think, as opposed to the peace that doesn't bring up conflict, the peace which frankly I often am part of. I'm not the most conflict-seeking person. Anyone who's worked with me or lived with me can tell you. And I'd rather that it just be quiet and pleasant. And that's not the peace, certainly, that Jesus is going to bring.
It makes me think of South Africa, which, Andy, as you know, I spent some time in at the tail end of apartheid, and how it created these Peace and Reconciliation Commission, which very much followed the path you're talking about. We weren't going to just pretend apartheid and all its evils didn't happen and we'll just kind of move on. It was actually, we're going to talk about it. We're going to actually have a testimony. We're going to actually surface it for the sake of a future hope for reconciliation, which, let's be clear, in its decisive form has not even happened in South Africa, right? They are still waiting for, but it has made significant progress precisely because they said the peace we need is not the absence of any tension or conflict. That's not going to work here. We have to surface it. We have to bring it up. And like, I love that image you said, sort of sit with it in expectation that somehow this will get addressed in the future. Maybe not even now or in the near future, but there will come a day that we are hoping for, looking for. And that really feels to me like the Advent peace. It's a peace that says there is a coming peace that allows us to actually puncture the more superficial peace right now, that gives us some ability, capacity to go there.
So should we talk about your least favorite Christmas song?
Okay, here's, this leads into the topic that I want to talk about.
I mean, this leads into it.
Because, all right, so listeners will know that Andy has been something of a, like, from a distance, mentor to me in music. We talk a lot about music. We've talked about on Good Faith about how music is crucial to shaping our understandings of the world, of God, of ourselves at a very deep level. And so I really think to understand this challenge and the way in which I think a lot of this challenge of Jesus' peace has gotten blunted, has gotten neutered, even in Christian culture itself, is to look at some traditional Christian hymns around Christmas. And I know these are, we're venturing into territory in which people have a lot of emotional attachment to these hymns. They have a lot of fond childhood memories. I do too. But nevertheless, I think we need to take a sort of a critical eye at what is the message and what is the formation that is being done by some of these Christian hymns that we sing on Christmas and even unknowingly are perhaps reinforcing this more neutered version of peace. So, Andy, I'm going to ask you to pick one version of a song, one version of a traditional hymn that may be otherwise beloved and very meaningful, but does have some of this, what I'm calling this neutering, pacifying effect on us.
Okay, so I'm going to go first, and then you're going to gore an even more sacred ox.
Exactly.
I'm going to go, right? Okay. Well, I have thought this a lot about O Little Town of Bethlehem, a beloved text. I love it. We sing it at Christmas time in our home by this wonderful, wonderful minister and eventually Bishop, Phillips Brooks. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie above thy deep and dreamless sleep. Okay, so what is, this is something that could only be written by someone at a very significant distance from the actual Bethlehem. So then and now, so today Bethlehem is under the authority of, I guess, the successor government to the Palestinian Authority. It's the home of Palestinian Christians, in the spiritual and literal home of Palestinian Christians in Israel, Palestine. It is the site of terrible violations of the dignity of Palestinians. It has also been the origination of terrorist attacks across the border as it's been constructed into Israel, right? So, it's which by no fault of the Palestinian Christians, by the way, but by the Islamist pursuers of justice for the Palestinians as they understand themselves. And it's like it's the least quiet, dreamless place you can imagine on our planet right now. But of course, this was also true 2,000-ish years ago. And the historical Bethlehem is interesting because the first time we really pay attention to it is when one of its own citizens is this is a terrible thing to bring up, but it's where it comes up in the Bible. She's traveling with her kind of common law husband, who's a Levite, but he has this, sometimes it's translated concubine, but it's not quite fair, I think, to call her that. They have a real relationship and a relationship of love, she's not just being used by him. They're traveling together, and they go into this town, and the town is very unhospitable, to say the least. It's this awful story in the book of Judges, where she ends up being raped on the threshold of the house where they're staying, is left for dead, dies overnight, and the man finds her in the morning. She is known as the Bethlehemite. So the very first time we encounter the name of Bethlehem, it's through this woman who suffers the most egregious violence and violation. And in a further act of terror, her husband is so angry that he dismembers her body and sends the pieces of her body throughout Israel to summon Israel to war against the men of this region. It leads to a civil war that is the utter destruction of the compact of brotherhood between the tribes of Israel. And that ends with even more rape, by the way. The end of Judges, the last few chapters, it's just horrible stuff. All of this revolving around this figure who's known by her hometown, and her hometown is Bethlehem. So let's just, now later it's the city of David, right, or the town of David. And the reason it's the town of David, it's the place that Ruth and Naomi go back to after this calamity, right, of all these things that happened to this poor woman, Naomi, whose husband leaves Bethlehem with her and their two sons and moves to Moab. They die, he dies. Naomi and Ruth, two unprotected women, go back to Bethlehem. I mean, it's like saying, I don't know, pick the terrible things are happening in Syria right now. It's like saying, I think I'll move back to Syria. Like no one who knows what's happening in the civil war today, as we're speaking in Aleppo and other parts of Syria, would be like, oh, great, head on back. That's how Bethlehem feels when Ruth and Naomi go there. So that's the deep history of Bethlehem. That's its first point of reference. Then David, of course, is from there. David becomes king. Many, many years later, there's this expectation that one day the Messiah will, in fact, come out of Bethlehem. But of course, when Mary and Joseph arrive in Bethlehem, it's a scene of total chaos because of this Roman census that's being taken, where everybody's having to return to their hometown to get properly accounted for. There's no room, at least not in a proper guest room, right? So they end up in the corner of the house where the animals are kept. I think, by the way, I'm convinced that in an honor society like this, if you have family there, they're going to find some place to put you. It's not like there's this hotel owner who's like, I'm sorry, all our rooms are full. He's got family in Bethlehem because he's from that house. Right. So somebody feels the obligation, but nobody has room. So they're like, well, there's the place where the animals lie. I guess that's all we've got for you. This is not a scene of dreamless quiet. It's anxiety, it's displacement, it's migration, but all layered on this kind of palimpsest or this multi-layered history of all furthest back violence and violation. Yeah. So maybe so a little town of Bethlehem. It requires an incredible suspension of historical and present knowledge to sing those words with a straight face. Right. And I have a thought. Well, I want you to share yours because you're going to make people much more angry with your Christmas carol you want to defenestrate than mine. But I actually have a thought about how we can sing them properly at Christmas, but I want to save it till after you go through your. Okay, save that because I think we're trying to go there. Folks, we're not just trying to bum you out and completely strip your enjoyment of Christmas hymns. I do think on the other side of this, there is a deeper piece. Rather than just, hey, everything's okay. Okay, so with that, here's my bumming you out about your favorite hymn. It's Silent Night. Silent Night. So let me read the lyrics. It's very similar in feel to A Little Town of Bethlehem. Yeah. Silent night, holy night, all is calm,
all is bright, round yon virgin mother and child, holy infant so tender and mild. Sleep in heavenly peace. Sleep in heavenly peace. If the first verse didn't quite put you to sleep, the second verse is meant to really, put the clamps down on any alertness or awareness you have. But okay, so why do I think this is an example of this kind of neutering version of Advent that actually blunts the sharp edge of the Jesus kingdom? Because here we have this I think this ultimate pacification, like literal pacification of Jesus as an infant. Like, it's tender and mild. This is not the Prince of Peace who have come to bear a sword, right? Yeah. This is tender, mild, not going to disturb anybody, not going to even disturb anybody's sleep, not even going to disturb the parents' sleep, because this child is like, they've got the program. What is that sleep program that everybody was on? The sleep through the night program. Like, Jesus has mastered it already. This is a scene that's drawn from the birth narrative that the authors are imagining. They skip what happens next in the narrative, especially in Matthew 2, to what happens to infants next in the narrative, right? Because in the next very passage, Matthew 2, 16 to 18, that birth scene, tender, which is described as tender, mild, everybody's quiet, asleep, in silence, is followed by an absolutely horrific scene. It is the scene where Herod, because Herod is the king and believes that, okay, wait, there's a new king that's been announced. I got to get rid of this new king. Sends his soldiers to basically commit infanticide of anybody that could possibly be that threatening king. And it conveys this sense that this arrival of this infant is not something about tender and mild. It's about something that provokes resistance and defense, even to the point of violence, because there's something challenging. There's something threatening about this Jesus that the ruling, existing kings and kingdoms are going to want to resist.
So I have a thought, though, and I did not have this thought until we started talking, and that either means it's a really good one or I should let it season and not risk your podcast on it. So can we sing, I was thinking, gosh, can anyone sing Silent Night if they take Curtis's critique of it seriously, or Little Town of Bethlehem, in that wonderful Christmas Eve service that so many of us find beautiful and meaningful, and with the candles and all that? And I think we can if we've celebrated Advent. Because what is the word for Advent? You mentioned, arrival and so forth. But if there's a command that's associated with Advent, it is actually the command, wake up, awake, awaken. There's a famous text of Advent, often sung to a wonderful setting by Johann Sebastian Bach, called Wachet auf, awake Jerusalem. Because in Advent, traditionally, the church did not primarily spend Advent anticipatorily singing Christmas songs. So the way that Advent now works, practically speaking, or the holiday season works after Thanksgiving in America and most Western countries, is all the Christmas music starts playing, right? So you have like 4 weeks of Christmas music. That is not how the church celebrated Advent. That music would have been played starting on Christmas and continuing for the 12 days of Christmas after Christmas. But during Advent, what you're doing, if you look at the texts that are read traditionally in Advent, they are the texts of the second coming of Jesus, Jesus' own foretelling, always drawing from either Matthew, Mark, or Luke, where Jesus actually, shortly before he enters Jerusalem in Passion Week, Jesus lays out the reality that Jerusalem is going to be besieged and destroyed, and uses that to discuss also the reality that the entire world will be under God's judgment, just as Jerusalem is going to be under Roman judgment, so the world is going to be under God's judgment, and tells his followers, stay awake. So the refrain of Advent is not go to sleep, it's wake up. And what do we wake up to? The way that our world is under judgment, the way that violence has characterized what we've done with what God gave us. And I actually think if we spent 4 weeks of Advent, and it's almost impossible to imagine doing this like when you're surrounded by Santa, but if you spend 4 weeks of Advent really taking on board like the just judgment of the world that already has been revealed in some ways, but we await the full just judgment of the world. And if you actually spend it waking up, as we are told to do, and staying awake, it's not just wake up from somebody, it's actually keep awake. In other words, Jesus says, Don't get sleepy, or you will feel sleepy, but be like the 10 virgins who know that the bridegroom's coming at some point to get the marriage feast going, and they keep their light burning, and they basically keep the lights on so that they don't fall asleep and forget that the bridegroom's coming.
Yeah.
So if Advent is about keeping awake, I actually think that then we could come to Christmas Eve having kind of fully confronted in ourselves and in our world that which is not at peace and which invites the sword of the Prince of Peace. We might be able to then come to Christmas Eve and grasp like what that vision of peace actually is for. Because it is also true that there is going to be that stillness on the other side of conflict, that there is going to be that reconciliation, which we've not fully experienced in any human polity, but that in Jesus' polity, there will be this restoring of all things, and it will feel like the kind of beautiful calmness at the end of a storm that is invoked by our Christmas Eve services. The problem is right now, we skip the staying awake part and just sing about the going to sleep part. Right. So yeah, I think more Advent, actually, the more Advent you have, the more authorized you should feel to imagine a Bethlehem,
right,
where the silent stars go by and where there's this kind of harmony.
That's a beautiful word. And what I want to talk next with Andy is how then do we put this into practice? How then do we use Advent to actually wake up to the ways in which the world is not currently at peace, both the world out there, but also our inner worlds, our relational worlds. How do we wake up in this season to that in a way that leads us to eventually, when that moment has come on Christmas Eve, we can sing it in the right way as a way to say, we're seeing about the arrival, the coming return, re-arrival, if you will, of the Jesus that will actually bring about that true peace. Let's talk more about practically whether it's in how we experience Advent services or design Advent services. For those of you who there's a lot of people who listen who are pastors or worship leaders to this podcast who you have some power to help us do this. But also then for those of us who are just in our own daily lives, how do we go about Advent such that it's a waking up to the true promise of true peace that doesn't avoid conflict and pain and suffering, but actually takes us through it?
You gotta teach the conflict that's in the text. The scriptures, like Bethlehem. I mean, so I gave a little riff on like what's layered into the history of Bethlehem, but kind of for understandable reasons, I would guess you've never heard that preached ever.
Yeah.
Like, and I will say, I think, I felt a little bad even raising it like 10 minutes into a podcast because I don't know where people are. I don't know who's with you as you're listening. I don't know what your own frame of mind is. I don't know what your own story is of exploitation, even that this might surface or trigger. And it's risky to bring up how horrible things get in the Bible, Yeah. At the same time, if we've never taught about it, if we've never spoken about it, then we're missing huge pieces of Scripture and the Gospels, because Jesus does. Advent is a time to reflect on, they're sometimes called the little apocalypses. So an apocalypse being a biblical document that kind of lays out a time of final judgment. Well, Jesus himself gives one or more talks, as it were, as he approaches Jerusalem that are preserved in the 3 synoptic Gospels. And it's just amazing how little that's taught on.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be teaching on it. And frankly, we need to be teaching about what in fact happened, because I think many people have some vague awareness, but in fact, 40 years after Jesus predicted it, it literally happened that the Roman armies came against the kind of messianic counter revolution and razed the city to the ground and defiled the temple and did all the things Jesus basically prophesied would happen. By the way, another relevant thing happens. Before Jesus enters the city for the first time during Passion Week, he weeps outside and he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I have wept over you and wished I could gather you under my wings the way a mother hen gathers her chicks. I may be conflating the different versions of this, but in one of the Gospels, he said, if only you had known the things that make for peace.
Make for peace, yeah.
So in our teaching, in the right way at the right time, I think we need to be paying attention to how much Jesus himself talks about conflict. I mean, just, as is sometimes observed, Jesus is actually basically the only one in the New Testament who talks at length about hell. The Apocalypse of John talks about it also, the lake of fire and that kind of thing. But Jesus, like, over and over talks about this place of judgment. We've got to teach that stuff because it actually gives us a framework for acknowledging, lamenting, and confessing our complicity in all the things that will invite the judgment of God. So that's one set of thoughts for like those who have teaching and kind of worship responsibilities in a way. But here's my thought about what individuals could do. And it's a hard thing to do. All entrenched conflicts are sustained by a double narrative of victimhood. So all conflicts where that just keep going, especially those that go on for generations. So think about the Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland, Northern Ireland. Think about Israel and Palestine today. But also think about the entrenched conflicts in your own life. And you will quickly be able to identify the way in which both sides have a version of the story that is not untrue, in which they are the true victims, the ones who are truly marginalized, the ones who are truly oppressed, all that. And I think one really interesting discipline for Advent is to take a conflict, either a global one, like Israel and Palestine, or a very personal one in your own family or friendships or former church or whatever, and spend some time recounting the narrative of the other side in its truth. So that other party in the conflict, which I'm currently not at peace, has a story, parts of which I do not accept, about how they're the ones in the wrong, but parts of what they say I should accept. And part of my responsibility in that conflict is to empathetically let my guard down, at least in my own thought and prayer life, and acknowledge that they have a right to feel aggrieved. I mean, to be geopolitical, I myself have a great deal of sympathy and a sense of solidarity, frankly, with the modern nation of Israel, even though I don't identify it with the ancient biblical nation per se. But there are many things I admire about the modern state of Israel. And I certainly believe they have a right to exist and exist in the land that they were given. Therefore, my responsibility in Advent may be to really dwell on the story of the Palestinians who also have lived in that land for a long time, who now live under the government of Israel one way or another, and to let my sympathies, which do rest with Israel in lots of ways, if you had to put me to the point politically, fully take on board the other side's story. Not to solve it, not to convert, not to become anti-Israel and pro-Palestine, let's say, but just to live with why that conflict keeps going, which is the other side has a really good point, which is just true over and over in all these stories.
Andy, I think that's so profound. It's such a interesting practice. It's one that I will find personally challenging for me on a number of fronts. But I think about our listeners and what Christmas brings, because what Christmas brings often is the internal retelling of victim narratives, right? Because we're getting back together oftentimes with family of origins, where a lot of these original victim narratives often are most viscerally embedded in us, because there's been some real actual ways we've been wronged by our family of origin. And then I think what you're saying is the nursing of those victim narratives is what keeps the conflict going and makes for the eternal conflict, because that's the only story we rehearse over and over again. And so if we want to anticipate a different kind of peace, a Jesus peace that challenges the prevailing notions of peace or prevailing internal conflicts that we nurse. One step which we can gesture, we can point to, we can signify there's a different peace that has broken in and will finally break in is by actually saying, well, what would that story sound like in the final judgment? In that final judgment, there will be a full accounting where all sides get to tell their story, and there is a final weighing of it by the true judge that has arrived on the scene. And I think what you're saying is we've got to learn to hear the other side's story, because in the final judgment, in that advent that we're all waiting for, we're arriving, we want to see happen, that, if you will, that cosmic courtroom scene that we will all have our own role in it, we're going to hear the other side, and there's going to be some sense we're like, oh, yeah, they kind of have a point. And in fact, the judge is going to be like, that's a good point, which doesn't obliterate our sense of what was wrong, how we were wronged. It's just, it complexifies it. And it therefore enables us to actually hopefully move to some grace, maybe even some forgiveness, maybe even some reconciliation, but at least begin to gesture in that direction. And we have to, because that's the future. That's where history is headed. That's what the final judgment is going to be like for all of us in all of our ways that we've been victimized. There's another side to that story that we're going to have to embrace. It's a very profound, I've never heard that as an Advent practice, but it seems to me very true to the spirit of what we're talking about, Andy. What's hard is because we don't have a lot of images of peace that actually takes us through existing conflict. We just have images that edit it out, that obliterate, right? Like, so so in the church calendar, right? This is why we've edited out the celebration of the slaughter of the innocents. We just remove that, and we don't have, I think, a lot of good ways of imagery that combines that. And I was just now as we were talking, I was like, man, that's a tough challenge. I like to pride myself, like I'm good with metaphors, I'm good with images. I'm like, this is a tough one. The best I could come up with on the spot was, and it's an imperfect one, as all images are, but was the image of the UN peacekeeping force, right? Because it's a peacekeeping force.
Whoa, the blue helmets.
The blue helmets, right? And and they're armed. So it's not like, they're not like calm, peaceful, tender, and mild, but they're there to actually keep a peace that is going to be resisted by the existing forces that pervade in that region, right? They're there because somebody needs to come in and say, no, you can't keep killing each other like this. You can't keep inflicting violence. And it requires a certain force and risk. I mean, it's a risky endeavor to be part of the blue helmets, right? To be part of the blue. Now, again, because of the imperfections of the UN, they've done it imperfectly, but they're a best, or at least the best I can come up with right now, of an image that has this sense of like, no, it's a piece that enters, it doesn't edit away and tell you, go to sleep, no conflict here. It's like, no, there's a conflict here, and we're going to announce a peace that actually goes through this conflict.
Wow. That's amazing. That's better. That's really good. I'm trying to come up with something as good. I have an image in mind that's different, different in multiple ways. But I think that it actually gets to this, and it's an image I use quite a bit in worship. Actually, I often use it. I have us reflect on this image when I'm leading certain kinds of worship, because I think it's one of the most incredible images of the crucified and risen Jesus ever made. And it is a stained glass window called the Wales window, Wales as in the country of Wales. But it's installed in the 16th Street Baptist Church of Birmingham, Alabama. So the 16th Street Baptist Church is the site of a terror attack in I forget the exact year, 1963, I think. The bombing of the church that killed a number of Sunday school students, mostly girls. And 2 years later, the people of Wales took up a collection to have an artist create a stained glass window to be installed in the rebuilt, repaired 16th Street Church. And that history itself is extraordinary, but the image is amazing. And I really encourage people to go find a copy of this image. It's on the cover of Fleming Rutledge's incredible book, The Crucifixion. But you can find it if you Google Wales window Birmingham, you'll definitely find it. And so the interesting thing is that it's a kind of crucifix in that it represents Jesus and the cross together. But the Jesus who is represented, in addition not incidentally to being represented with dark skin and sort of African features. He's clothed in white, robes of white. He is not impaled on the cross, even though the cross is visible behind him. He is actually in the shape of a cross, holding together the whole frame. I can't possibly do justice to this in words, but his hands are outstretched in such a way that they meet the edges of the frame of the window. And it's this picture of Jesus holding the whole world together. And behind him is a rainbow, which is, of course, one of the major symbols in Scripture of reconciliation, the bow in the sky to say, I'm no longer going to bring devastation on the earth. And to me, it's an image of Jesus as, like Colossians talks about, the one in whom all things hold together, the one who restores all things to unity. There's kind of powerful, condensed, and very tense but complete unity in the picture. The figure of Jesus is not at rest. The figure of Jesus is actually acting to hold the world together through his cross, right? And beyond it in his resurrection.
I'm looking at it now. There's a strain and a struggle that's being conveyed by Jesus to do this, to embrace the tensions and rifts of the world.
He's pushing out to bring everything together, or to hold everything together. Yeah. And gosh, all the layers of that, right? So here's this, in many ways, beautiful, admirable image placed in the site of a terrible act of violation. Here is Jesus, Lord, but on the other side of crucifixion. Like it's the best I can think of like something you could show people. And if you told them the story, they'd start to get the sense of what it means to be Jesus, of what it means for Jesus to be the Prince of Peace.
Well, I love that image. I'm looking at it now. We'll put a link in it in the show notes. I think this really calls for, this deep need we have for different new images of a Jesus peace that at least can complement the traditional ones that we have to actually fill out the picture, so to speak, of the full dimensions of Jesus peace. Again, one that is not put us asleep to existing pain and conflict in the world, but actually cause us to wake up to it with the hope that there is a king who has already embraced it and is straining to bring the world back together. So I want to end our podcast with just on practicality, because I've been thinking about this more, like how practically, how can we celebrate a different Advent season that more points to this notion of peace? And it's again about images, Andy, since we've been talking about images. And I've been thinking about what are the dominant images that we share as news in the Christmas season, right? Because if Advent is about proclaiming the news of Jesus's kingdom, how do we proclaim it? Well, in the first century setting of the imperial parousia that, Andy, you've talked about, they did that a lot through images. I mean, sure, there was the announcement of the messenger saying, the king is coming, or the king has come to rule. But a lot of this in first century Roman Empire was done through coins, through statues that would announce, this sort of picture of Augustus in the idealized depiction of what a Roman ideal of beauty, with pictures of grain and abundance, or pictures of military victory. It was of prosperity. It was like, everything's cool, everything's awesome now that Augustus is king. And those would be the images that pervade the empire, that would be sent out throughout the empire. And I was thinking about that, in our current contemporary culture, what are the images we tend to send out? Now, here again, just like our deconstruction of Silent Night, I am on risky territory, because I'm going to be talking about something that all of us are participate in, which is the Christmas update that we send out.
Oh my gosh.
Now, again, let me be clear. I appreciate any communication from my friends. And so thank you for sending them to me. I just want us to invite all of us to do a little bit of reflection and examination of the images that pervade these news announcements that we send out to one another on Christmas. Most of them are devoid of much text. They're mostly images.
Wow. It's and more so. There used to be whole letters.
Used to be whole letters, but now
it's just a well-chosen image with some cursive script over it.
Yes, courtesy of Shutterfly, nicely laid out. And I just can't help but noticing, and again, this is not a critique of any individual person that does this. This is an invitation to reflect on how all of us have bought into
it's a critique of every person. It's not it's everyone who has ever sent you a Christmas card.
No, please, I don't mean that. Please keep me. Don't. I've already. Maybe I should stop. So I can't help it. I do this count, and the vast majority of these images are of a different kingdom. It's of the magical kingdom, the kingdom of Disney. It's the kingdom of vacation. It's the kingdom that actually pronounces like the peace that we really aspire to is the peace of freedom from labor and the peace of a carefully curated vacation experience with a carefully curated scene behind us that's like meant to say to all of us, wow, you got to go there? No, I'm glad to receive that news and at one level, but the pervasiveness of how much of these images that we send out are about celebrating some vacation we took, I think we need to just pause and reflect. What are we saying about what true peace is? I think what we're saying, I invite us to consider, is we're saying the peace that we really want is the peace of absence of labor, absence of toil, and where everything is like curated for us. So much so that we curate even the image of it through a carefully crafted, framed selfie of this. And that's the news we send out to each other about our lives. I can't help but think that we're announcing, like I said, a kingdom of a peace that is not the Jesus peace. Okay, so Andy, bail me out here. How do we recapture this experience and in a way that I still get like cards and postcards from my friends?
I'm not sure that I or we can recommend a replacement picture to the happy, family on vacation at Disney or in Tuscany or whatever. Because almost any picture I would send out is going to kind of engrave a bit of there's going to be some missing truth and some perhaps misrepresented truth to it. Especially if you take what I think would be my actual suggestion, which is that somehow, well, frankly, our lives have to become less about tourism and more about pilgrimage. So tourism is about going places to be treated better than you are at home and to feel a kind of freedom from responsibility that you don't feel at home.
Yeah, that kind of peace, right? Yeah,
that kind of peace, right? That's the peace of Disney. So where am I journeying to as an individual? Am I going somewhere where I will be taken really good care of and, sort of treated like a king in a way that my own family doesn't? Or am I a pilgrim who is journeying to a place often that involves the relics or the reality of suffering, because this is the traditional site of pilgrimage was to the bones of the saints, often of the martyrs. The most famous pilgrimage is the Camino de Santiago, which leads to the Cathedral of St. James, and it's the memory of of James giving his whole life for the evangelization of Spain specifically and the world in a way. You're not going there to get there and be treated really well. And you don't expect you expect very simple accommodations along the way. What stories do you expect to tell? Well, I don't know what you expect to tell, but I'll tell you the stories people end up telling if they go on that Camino is how sore their feet were. I had a woman share an amazing story of this pilgrimage she took with her husband in the middle of life, having had very successful careers, being total planners and very, very successful optimizers. And they decided we're not going to plan or optimize anything. We're not even going to plan where we're going to stay night to night. Like you can look all that stuff up on the internet now, but they decided not to do that. And it was one of the most moving stories I've ever heard about a trip, but it did have an image of a blistered foot that is about the grossest image I've ever had to look at, shared by a friend at least. Because she got terrible blisters and ended up relying on other people on the pilgrimage to care for her.
Yeah.
And this is what pilgrimage is about. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be better than at home. In some ways, it's going to be harder, but it's going to take you somewhere where you will encounter, if you pray, you will encounter the reality of God in the midst of a broken world. Interestingly, I got to take my first extended trip to South Africa just a couple of weeks ago. And you mentioned early in the show that you lived there for a while, and I knew a little bit of that part of your life. And I went as a pilgrim to be with a few friends. And I will say, at times I was treated very well. There's incredible food in South Africa and wine and all that stuff. But I went because I know a few people who have been through the suffering, including the suffering that was in and around the end of apartheid 30 years ago. And I wanted to just learn more from that country. And I suppose that what we should be sending each other, whether in image or written form or some other form, is stories of the pilgrimage we're on. That is, where is the broken place you're traveling to to encounter God? Who have you met along the way? What happened that you didn't expect would happen, both good and bad, and there will be both. And how did you meet God in it? Because consistently when we go on these trips, I just have yet to meet someone who's undertaken one of these pilgrimages, who comes back and is like, yeah, there wasn't much for me there. Like every time there's something about this willingness to reorient your life that God just honors that in wildly different ways for different people. And that would be a very different kind of like Christmas card in a way.
Well, let's be clear. You're talking about a pilgrimage we intentionally go on and are choosing. There's also the pilgrims that have been chosen for us.
That we find ourselves on.
That we find ourselves in, right? Yes. Many of my friends are in hard pilgrimages through a parent's dementia, a child's mental health struggle, your own chronic illness or terminal illness even. We are all have been pilgrimages have been chosen for all of us that have this idea, truth of us being taken through and into places of suffering. And I actually agree with you, Andy. I don't think you can convey that in an image. I think that requires stories, that requires narratives.
Right. That's right.
It requires the word to tell that. I think that is why in the first century, when the Imperial Roman Empire was telling its news of this Pax Romana, it did it through coins and images and statues and so forth like that. But the gospel did it very differently. The gospel of Jesus did it through stories. It did it through extended narratives.
Images.
No images. Right.
Yes, because the image idealizes. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, I could send you some snapshots from my trip to South Africa, but it looks nice. And then, of course, I could send you. I didn't visit specifically a township. I visited some people who live and work in these remnants of the apartheid housing system, right? But suppose I had gone, as I have done in other places, to places of great material need and so forth. Then either I show you an idealized picture of the township, or I show you an extremely exploitative image that doesn't show it the way its own inhabitants would want to be seen, even if it's somewhat true of the reality in which they live, right? You can't make a picture of it that is truthful. Right. That's so interesting. You can idealize through an image, but you cannot ultimately tell like the full truth, especially about suffering, through an image.
And I actually think this is why people have so gotten away and resist the idea of writing a Christmas letter and default to the shutterfly move, right? Because it actually is, it's a pain. I write a Christmas letter every year, and it's hard. It's like, I kind of dread it, quite honestly. But I do it every year as a discipline, partly to try to convey something of the more complex pilgrimages that I am on, that our whole family is on, and so that you just can't do with a collection of selfies or any other kind of scenic images. It requires a story, and the act of having to commit yourself to tell a story is an invitation to tell the full dimensions of that, or the fuller dimensions. It's obviously never fully complete. But I find myself like, well, I'm going to write. I stare at a blank page. What am I going to say? And it inevitably forces me to kind of ask those harder questions. And so I guess this is my invitation to my friends. Please, if all you can do is send me a postcard in the traditional shutterfly mode, please keep doing that. I want to hear from you. I want to see you on vacation. That's great. What I really even more want, maybe in addition to that, if nothing else, send me a word, send me words, send me some text that actually forces you to be like, oh, what am I going to say about my year? What pilgrimages have I been on? What suffering have I been taking through? How am I going through it? In a way that actually points me to the ultimate hope I have, the ultimate peace that I believe lies on the other side of it. I know you can't cram all of that in a letter, but you can give me a glimpse of that through a story, through some description in text of the fuller realities of your life that just can't be captured by a montage. And so it's an invitation. Consider doing that this year. If you haven't done that, is to send out some text, even just an accompanying text to the photos that you send out, and see where that leads you. See what that act of re-narration of your year. It's another version of what I think Andy talked about earlier with when we are forced to narrate, the other sides of our lives, we discover the fuller truth that's present in our lives. So it's an invitation. Please think about doing that. Those of you who know me, those of you who are right now, as you listen to this, thinking about what you're going to be sending out, the news you're going to be sending out this year. Andy, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for once again blessing our audience with this. And I hope you have a peaceful Christmas in the truest, fullest sense of that peace.
Thank you. A very meaningful Advent and a truly joyful Christmas to you and everybody who's listening.
Indeed. And listeners, we want to wish you peace this Christmas, and kind of in the vein of that, the peace that we wish upon one another does include suffering and loss. I'm really saddened to announce the passing of a friend. Actually, I think it's a friend of both Andy and I, Amy Lowe, who was on my podcast just a few weeks ago, telling her story with terminal cancer. She died very suddenly recently, I just learned. And so I want to send out our peace to the family of Amy Lowe, which is the peace that transcends all understanding. We can't possibly understand the loss that's going on. We wish for the peace that is to come when we look forward to, we wake up to the day when Jesus raises us from the dead and restores and repairs all that's broken. One way to think about that vision is that's the day when the Lord will have his way, and the Lord will have his way fully. And that's why I want to close this episode with a song called "The Lord Will Have His Way." It comes from our album Songs for the After Party that we created in partnership with the Porter's Gate folks. The Lord Will Have His Way by Dee Wilson and Imani Wilkins. With that, we invite you to enjoy this and look forward to regathering around the campfire.
May our love have power over hate. May our love have power over hate. May his gentle way cause our hearts to break. May our love have power over hate.
May his truth have power over lies. May his truth have power over lies. Let the word of God open up our eyes. May his truth have power over lies.
The Lord will have his way. The Lord will have his way. Though the nations rage, they will plot in vain, but the Lord will have his way. May his peace have power over war. May his peace have power over war. May the voice of God calm the violent storm. May his peace have power over war. The Lord will have his way. The Lord will have his way. Though the nations rage, they will plot in vain, but the Lord will have have power over fear.
May our hope have power over fear.
With a warm embrace, he will hold each tear. May our hope have power over fear. The Lord will have his way. The Lord will have his way. Though the nations rage, they will plot in vain. Though the kingdoms rise, they will pass.